thinking about today's talk and the two of us as kind of products of Chinese identity, but not necessarily in how we should try to kind of explore in a authentic or pure form. We're both children of migrants and people that have left China over the decades and intermingled and married locals, and then we've both ended up coming back. And so we were thinking about the title and how we should frame it, and I think we came across this, in Chinese culture, there's the old duck, and the fresh blood, and this kind of duality between tradition and newness. And does tradition necessarily mean something stagnant or something old, and does newness necessarily mean something good and something innovative? And actually, is there more going on than just two sides?
Right. And I think it's a topic that a lot of people can relate to as well, whether being from Chinese heritage, born overseas, or left to go overseas, or just being quite global now. How do you discuss what authenticity is, and discover or rediscover what we call Chinese cuisine?
Yeah. So just to kind of introduce, this is my grandfather and my grandmother. He left China. He left Shanghai before the Second World War. Went to England, and then basically never came back. And then here I am now, 70, 80 years later, living in his hometown.
This is my uncle and my aunt. They were born in Taiwan, and they ended up in LA in California in their 20s. And just really integrated into California 70s culture and American food while bringing their traditions over. I mean, for example, my auntie Grace here, she's always made braised Taiwanese dishes, but one of her favorite guilty pleasures is pizza, leftover, straight from the fridge the next day.
Cool. So I think we were going to start with kind of trying to frame in a way that we can then test at the end whether we still believe that what authenticity is and what innovation is in the context of Chinese food.
Yeah.
This is one of my grandfather's restaurants. So when my grandfather moved to England, he became a restaurateur, and we had multiple restaurants when I was a kid. And so I grew up in these kind of anglicized Chinese restaurants serving kind of Chinese food to Westerners.
Yeah, this is growing up in Princeton, New Jersey. My uncle, who's Filipino-Chinese, opened a very beloved small sushi joint and kind of brought his own way of cooking there and became like a local fixture.
And then this is a menu from one of my grandfather's Chinese restaurants, the Bamboo in Liverpool. And the menu is, 50% English food, roast beef and Yorkshire puddings, and then it's the naming is chicken and mushrooms with rice, and curried minced beef with rice, and we tried to guess what these dishes were in if they were Chinese. What dishes is he talking about? Chicken and mushroom, that could be so many things. But yeah, this is the early 1950s, and the whole menu was 3 shillings and 6 pence, which I think is probably about 25 RMB. So we were going to start off with the grand dame of Chinese cooking in a kind of a Western context. This is Fujian Dunlop. And so when we're talking about authentic Chinese food, we were discussing different people who obviously add to the richness of Chinese, the canon of Chinese cuisine, and kind of exploring it and putting it in a format that people can take away and learn from and understand. And I think Fujian Dunlop is probably the go-to.
Yeah, I actually learned how to cook Chinese food by buying Fujian Dunlop's book, Every Grain of Rice, when it came out by now 10 years ago, I think. And for me, I was, maybe still am, a bit obsessed with this idea of authenticity. And my mom thought it was really odd that I chose to learn Chinese cooking from a British woman. But I just thought, she has some of the most authentic recipes because she's lived in China, traveled China, and You know, she herself like tries to maintain authenticity and tell where the recipes come from and how long it's been made. So she is also my go-to for having a baseline for what is the real dish.
So this slide is actually a screenshot from her Instagram a few days ago, and she made a recipe that she makes all the time, a mapo tofu, and she decided to substitute the beef for mushrooms, but she used fresh shiitake, and she says, but my feelings is that the mushrooms have such an assertive additional flavor that although it's delicious, it's not really mapo tofu anymore. Perhaps next time I'll try vegan mince instead. And it's this idea that she's very aware of the kind of boundaries of how we define this dish, and if you take this and do that and move that around, is it really authentic anymore? Is it what the kind of if I presented it to someone else, would they see it as mapo tofu? Would they be like, what is this? You've changed so many elements. It's now bolognese. It's something else. And I find that really interesting that she herself has these certain kind of barriers or boundaries, that kind of that spectrum of how 5% under and over that you can mess with the recipe. But then a few days later, I came across Chef Yubo, who's maybe one of the most famous Sichuan chefs in the world. A kind of master of Sichuan cuisine, and now he lives in California, and he adds avocado to his mapo tofu. And the LA Times said it was like a masterstroke genius. It's such an amazing evolution of this dish. This avocado adds so much a different dynamic, and it actually, they didn't go as far to say it improves the dish, but they said, what an amazing piece of innovation.
When you first showed this to me, my first reaction was, that's wrong. It's so wrong. And then you explained who the chef was, and somehow I thought, oh, he's a famous Sichuanese chef. It's okay.
He can do it. He's allowed to do it.
So who is allowed?
And so this is where our personal experiences as being, children of a mixed culture come into play, because we have that link to this authentic, credible face, this Chinese ancestor in our family, that we feel perhaps cooked for us authentic food, and then we've grown up in a different context that doesn't allow for us to express those changes. And now there's this kind of like movement of like preserving and maintaining authenticity at all cost.
It seems in the US and in Europe, there are a lot more Chinese restaurants opening that are trying to represent authentic regional cuisine.
Sure.
And trying to educate people about that.
So then, for me, the answer is our personal memory of our family experience, that our ancestors that left at a certain point in time, are they more traditional in what they cooked from a kind of, perhaps pre-revolutionary period, to compare present-day China that's had 70 years of progress and internal innovation? How do those two spirits of Chinese cuisine then reconnect? And you have this sort of conversation in lots of places that have had a division and then a kind of reunification, like Germany, or how might Korean food exist if there's a reunification of the two sides. You have one that's stuck in time and it hasn't evolved, and then one that's kind of sprinted into the future, and has embraced globalization, westernization, modernization, commercialization.
So what were some of the things your grandfather would do for his menu?
So from my personal memories, he cooked only a very limited spectrum of Shanghainese food, and he absolutely loved Cantonese food. And so my grandfather was a sailor, and he was on ships, and he would go back and forth between China and Europe maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And there would be various stopping points on the way of this journey. This is the 1930s. Trips took 8 weeks, maybe longer, depending on weather and all sorts of things. And I remember growing up with a very large amount of Cantonese food at home. That things that my dad would make. But then there's like things from the Ningbo area that are kind of flavor-wise very similar, but maybe they're prepared differently. My dad makes this soup with rice cakes, pork, and pickled cabbage. But that kind of dish does exist, but it's a fried dish. It's not a soup. And so was that his own invention, or was that a dish that existed before the Second World War, when maybe people were poorer and had less money and they wanted something that would fill them up? Or is it did it exist and has it died out? Those are the sorts of questions that I kind of always ask about the food that my grandfather cooked. So, and he would do like a whole fish, kind of Jiangnan style, with ginger and tofu, but it was with lemon sole, because you couldn't get the Chinese fish in the UK, so he would use a lemon sole. And my dad always says, like, he would come home after work and make a whole fish for himself and just eat the whole fish. So like things like that. So he had a very kind of, also, there's so many dishes that he would have grown up with that he didn't cook himself because he just didn't like them. And in immigrating to another country, you don't have to fill the table with dishes that you kind of so about. He would just not bother cooking them. I wasn't into that cabbage dish, so I don't make it anymore. And so I was never exposed to the full spectrum of what dinner could be in Shanghai until I actually came here. First came here 12 years ago. And suddenly I remember going to my dad's cousin's house and asking if she could get some char siu baos, and she said, "You don't get them here. They're not really very common in Shanghai. We'll have to go into town to get them." And I was like, oh, okay. I thought that was like Granddad's favorite thing. No, they're not from here. So tea egg. So, in the kind of last year, I've been trying to reflect on a lot of these kind of very, I would say, like background dishes that you kind of are so everyday and so just almost forgotten. They're just so there within the kind of the streets and restaurants and stuff, and they're not necessarily the star of the show. And I was thinking about tea eggs, and they're kind of ubiquitous. They're in like a Lawson, and they're in the corner of the street, and they're in the corner of your eye when you get some baozi. And so, how can there be a discussion around the kind of conditions or like the history of these things? And so I was thinking, tea in China, there's this kind of changing culture, and China is becoming this coffee drinking country, and China's also growing coffee, so it's kind of unique in that aspect that there should be a kind of legitimate how should I say, development of a unique Chinese coffee culture, because I think if you can look at somewhere like Italy, Italians have a very defined coffee culture that they're very protective of, but coffee is not grown in Italy. It's a totally imported product. So how can they claim to something that they don't really have that full, from start to finish? They don't have that input of cultivating and harvest and all the picking and the drying. It just comes off the boat, and then they're like, right, this is our culture now. Their culture is purely around the consumption, So whereas I think tea culture goes so much deeper because it's part of the landscape here, and it's part of the labor force and the mentality and understanding of seasonality. So how can we change something like a tea egg? So I came up with this recipe for coffee eggs using Yunnan coffee and keeping the recipe basically the same, but subbing out the tea and switching in ground coffee and doing this kind of modern reflection on the change in China and how that can be expressed through the recipes that use tea. So then I made these coffee eggs, which are actually really delicious, because coffee and soy sauce and shaoxing and all these heavy spices like star anise and cinnamon bark actually really work well with coffee. Because with tea, you put star anise and licorice in tea, you basically just taste the star anise and the licorice. Tea is so delicate that sometimes that spices can just overwhelm it. Whereas coffee is like a real strong, gutsy background. So you get this very prominent and very supportive, where all the different aspects of the recipe kind of come together. And I just thought, wow, this is actually, I don't want to say it's better, but it's very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's that fine line between, the Bon Appetit generation, where they would create a recipe like this and say, oh, we're elevating Chinese food. And that's like a totally, I would say, incorrect approach to take. And that's again coming back to like who gets to say what's authentic, who gets to say what's good, who gets to say what's relevant or has meaning.
Yeah. You mentioned Bon Appetit and thinking about update or the word innovation,
Oh yeah.
I guess it's a bit problematic because just looking through history of the people, the first Chinese generation that moved to the US, I think they were just adapting to their circumstances. Like you said, your grandfather was using the ingredients that were available and making the food that he liked, not,
Sure.
charging himself with the task of, carrying the torch for regional Chinese cuisine. And so, yeah, I think, with recipes like this, I like that you're adapting, and I think the intention is to keep the ingredients to where it comes from and incorporate, a sense of understanding of the traditional methods. So,
I mean, to discuss innovation in a Chinese context, I picked the washing up liquid, that company Baimao, that's decided that because they're in the business of lemons, they should make lemonade. And so I saw this at the Lawson and thought, that's odd. And actually, I think this is and I tried it. It's just like a very generic lemonade. It's nothing special to it. But I bought it because I thought the branding was hilarious. But I think this is a nice example of just because you can doesn't mean you should. And that is also kind of goes in this kind of discussion with Diaspora of like, oh, I'm a product of this particular province and this ancestry, and now I live in somewhere else in the world, and I should therefore have this sense of like that I should update, I should bring my own personality to something, I should have my say. What's the word? Imposter syndrome. Of saying that you as a kind of mixed race child of a diaspora can claim to be able to do something authentically if you've never experienced the physical place of living here. Because I think that if I reflect on 4 years being here, I don't necessarily know if living here even for much longer would necessarily give me that credibility to be authentic or lay claim to any kind of authentic cooking. I think I'll always feel like I'm on the fringes or on the edge.
Why, basically, why do you think there's an obsession with authenticity and placing food? And do you think it's a way for people, Chinese people born overseas or within China, to claim ownership or try to express their own identity?
Yeah, I think authenticity is, it's. I think there's a mistake in saying that authenticity means good. Authenticity can also mean terrible. I think a really funny example would be, if you had a friend visiting and they came and said, "Oh, I want to go eat at the most authentic Chinese restaurant," you would probably want the service to be pretty shoddy, and maybe that would be part of the experience. That would be part of the joke. That would be part of the fun. Oh, this place, loud, like Old Jesse, great food, terrible service, but it's authentic, and not every single thing is like Michelin-starred level, exquisite. The interior is terrible. The lighting is horrible. So how do we define what really is authentic? Authentic isn't quality either. If I go to the US and I go, I want to have an authentic burger, is it going to be a Michelin-starred $100 burger, or is it going to be a $5 burger with a piece of plastic cheese in kind of a plastic bun? That's authentic. No one wants to mess with these things because they're part of our internalized culture and the social context that we've grown up in, and they're good memories we had when we were younger, and we want to recreate those and we want to share those. So I think there's that one aspect of authenticity that we need to acknowledge, and you kind of park it there. Then, authenticity is, a kind of byword for nationalism. It's my cuisine. It's not your cuisine. You have something similar in your country, but mine's better. I think this is a dialogue that I've seen so much on social media. Whenever I post a video of Jen Bing in the morning, I get 100 messages from India saying, "Oh, it looks like a dosa, but a dosa's better." And it's just like, oh, keep scrolling, but don't rise to it. And so there's always this conversation of, and it also happens internally within China. People at Sichuan, Henan food, not very nuanced. It's a bit salty. But you come to Sichuan, we're the pros. And there's that rivalry, and so but then there's a sense of kind of like brotherly rivalry of like friends, that's fine. But then when it spills over into kind of, oh, I've never had that version, I've never been to your country, but I know mine's better, that's when it becomes problematic, and this kind of authenticity for the sake of preservation as well, where we need to protect something because we're worried that new forces, new globalization, new products or interests or trends will infringe on or somehow diminish those time-honored traditions that if we actually look at them historically, were at some point in themselves innovative and new, like Sichuan cooking.
Right. I mean, chili peppers didn't exist in Sichuan until a few hundred years ago, and now it's iconically tied to that region's cuisine. So at what point was that like an innovation, and at what point does it become something you don't mess with anymore, like the recipe for?
And there's so many other sciences in terms of, like plant science. There's a legal definition on when a plant that's introduced to a certain country becomes native. It's something like 300 or 400 years that you can take a plant from the Americas to Europe, like corn, but or even chilies. We consider those plants now natives of, you get certain European varietals, certain Asian varietals of chili and corn that are not necessarily visible or available in the it's from. So how do they become localized? And I think there's a kind of an agreed cutoff for certain sectors, but I think for food and for culture, where everything's a bit more ambiguous, it's like, well, where do you draw the line? Where do you say, okay, now this flavor or this dish has been impacted by that local terroir that makes it unique? I think that's no one's really asked that question.
It's feeling that if someone were to introduce a new style of Chinese dish or to make a swap in a gongbao chicken, that would just not be okay. It would be deviating, and it wouldn't even be appreciated as an innovation or improvement, or it just would be wrong. And so the weird thing, though, is I don't fundamentally agree with that. Like, has Chinese cuisine reached its peak? And are all the recipes like in a canon of, you can't touch it anymore? And
and just because something is new, is it innovation? Like kind of brands like Hey Tea and this cream cheese tea, is that really innovation in change for the better? Is that actually improving our consumption or understanding of tea as a product, as a crop? Are we actually appreciating tea more? Okay, tea consumption is going up like crazy because of these brands, but they're not necessarily better for us, or the farmers, or the planet, or anyone that's actually involved in it other than the shareholders of that company. Innovation is just it's not all about new, it's about change for the good. Change for the better. But then who defines what's better?
Right.
Well, we can definitely agree that some things are not better and say that, the kind of culture around cheese tea is fundamentally missing that link from the consumer to the farmer and the understanding of like the flavor of the tea and the process. It's industrialized and it's a commercial product. And we've discussed this as well before, innovation is, now we're in this time where it's driven by commercial interest and a commercially viable product that we can put to market. Whereas, innovation in a kind of historical Chinese context was a solution to a problem. This soy sauce. So last year I went on a trip to Shaoxing to Renchang soy sauce. There's a 310 or 311-year-old soy sauce garden. And their process is really unique because their soy sauce is called mother and child. And we're all very familiar with this concept of like a SCOBY or a sourdough, or like using this ferment that's many generations old. But what they do is that they make the soy sauce. They have the bacteria and the kind of heritage mother, but then they also, with the pressing of that year's soy, make soy cakes and then ferment them with the current bacteria that's in the air that year, and then they add that to the old bacteria. So you have the new and the old together, and that creates that kind of the dynamic product of that year that's unique. So it's not just producing that same soy sauce every year. It's every year is a different baby. for me, that's like total innovation when we compare other soy sauce producers. But soy sauce in itself was a solution. There was this location, they had this crop, this weather, this type of microbiome in the air, this ability to ferment, and they had these soybeans, and they had to make something, otherwise it would have gone to waste. Too much to eat, so we've got to make something. It's a solution to a problem. That is like the true embodiment of Chinese cuisine. It's not just taking the raw ingredients and cooking them together, but then that process is repeated and it becomes heritage of the area of the person, and then that becomes inherited, and then that becomes tradition. But so you kind of see how we move away from this concept of innovation because it seeps into this concept of traditional. This is the way it's done, so don't mess with it.
Right. For me, growing up in the US and experiencing Chinese food there, I do have this feeling that Chinese American food has become its own tradition. And then I think that's most it's solution based. The immigrants who moved there had to make do with what was available. They weren't trying to make the next like Wang Hong dish, adapting to the circumstances.
It was a very much you had to deal with the situation quickly as well. There wasn't this ability to kind of learn from experience each year and fine-tune a process, and but I think also how the cuisine of diasporas around the world, Chinese diasporas, there's also this fundamental lack of choice. If in Shanghai, you can go on the internet and pick from thousands of soy sauces and all the spectrum of flavor choices. So if you wanted something saltier or thicker or darker or glossier, you have that ability to customize and fine-tune and therefore have a certain level of kind of artistry over your cooking. Whereas I think a lot of diaspora, that they were getting soy sauce from Japan because for a long time, things like soy sauce were not necessarily being exported from China, because for a long time, China was only trading with other Soviet countries. So that diaspora in America and Europe were kind of like the flavors that we knew or we had are now no longer available to us. And so I think that is also part of the discussion of this kind of the return of the diaspora who have grown up with a sort of very limited spectrum of flavor or a limited choice of ingredients, of vegetables, of the types of fish, of that enormity of the larder of Chinese cooking, and they're coming back, and then it's like this overwhelming feeling of choice, and then it's like you can't help but try and want to experiment, and taste it all, and try everything, and try every style, and see how it's made, because there isn't that kind of everydayness where you go to the supermarket and it's there and you take it for granted,
I want to see more of the slides, the images and slides you've heard.
So, this was one where we wanted to discuss, this concept of diaspora, and people kind of think diaspora is just one thing. It's like everyone who's foreign, everyone who looks a bit Chinese but is foreign, and actually within diaspora, there's actually such enormous variation. And actually, on the left side is chop suey from the US, and on the right side is chop suey from the UK, or is how I would know chop suey in the UK. And actually,
I think in the US it's called egg roll.
You call them egg rolls, and for me, it's like that dish inside an egg roll. So there isn't always a commonality across these different communities. Everyone is on a divergent path, like a tree. We're all part of that same trunk, that same progenitor. The origin is the same, but we're all going in different directions. And it's that kind of muddledness of then coming back. And so for me, it's like British. Now in Shanghai, these American Chinese restaurants, I have no idea what any of the food is. For me, it's just as alien as going, a far distant province of China and being like, oh, this is not the food I recognize. I don't know what this dish is. So for me, a lot of the different diaspora groups around the world, I have also no knowledge of their history, their journey, their stories. So for me, food is it's like one of these things where we can look at food in total isolation in terms of like agriculture and dining experience and process and cooking, and actually, food for me is so much intertwined in like the rest of my life, and it's about like personal relationships, and it's about, you know, sexual relationships, and there's also things about like popular culture, queer culture, you know, so many non-food subjects all intermingle. And like, you know, the best food stories that I kind of have encountered are not necessarily like purely about food. And one of my favorite dishes is pasta puttanesca, which is basically translates as whore spaghetti. It's an Italian dish, and the legend is it was invented by a prostitute who was so busy that between clients that she didn't want to go to the market to be seen. You know, she's the village whore. So she would make a pasta dish with all store-cupboard ingredients, so that she didn't have no fresh ingredients in puttanesca. It's olives, anchovies, canned tomatoes, capers, and dried pasta. And so I thought, well, you know, the T-shirt this is the recipe T-shirt. So as you're wearing it and you're like, you know, in the kitchen in the morning, hungover, you just pull it like that and you can read the recipe.
So what's the ingredients in it?
Oh, so there's sesame paste, oil, soy sauce, garlic, white pepper, and furu. Fermented chili, fermented tofu paste, like chili furu.
Yeah, I love furu.
I'm obsessed. So I wanted to have a dish that was like personal in the sense of my personal taste, but also, you know, it's early morning, you've woken up, you don't have time to go out, you don't want to order something in, but you just want something quick. And then I also like this idea of having it on the back of a T-shirt, and for Chinese people to look at it and go, and that have that same experience that I have when I read like this muddled English text, and I'm like, and for them to have the same experience of like, scumbag noodles, what does that mean? And then to see this graphic on the back of the T-shirt, and for them to be like, I don't know.
Well, I like that, like creating a new tradition with, you know, your own story and preferences and stories that people can relate to. I mean, I think, you know, Lao Ganma, that was her own recipe, and it's become such a tradition and a product in and of itself. I think, you know, it reminds me of stories too, like Ma Po Tofu, which means
it's like horrendously disfigured woman, which I think is, you know, what are the things to call a dish? Like horribly disfigured woman tofu.
But at one point, it was a new thing.
Yeah. And probably the
when
name was part of the marketing strategy and the kind of attractiveness. When people sat down, they were like, pockmarked woman's face tofu. And they were like, oh, that sounds funny. And actually now we forget the joke. Or we forget what the pun was, or like the punchline was. Probably then there was some sort of humor around it, because it is a funny name. Yeah, I think this is the thing. It's like we have so many recipes or names of foods and history in different cultures that are funny, but we just don't think of it as funny. Like spotted dick in English. Spotted dick is an English pudding. It's a steamed cake with custard and raisins in it.
Okay. Well, let's talk about our most recent trip. Just last weekend, we were in Chaozhou, which was... I was very surprised by what I learned there. I wasn't expecting. I thought, oh, another region, somewhere I haven't been before. Let's see what the food is like. And then it actually opened up a whole...
you really questioned your
identity. Sorry?
You really questioned where your kind of food heritage was from.
Yeah, because
I think we all were kind of based.
So my dad is Fujian Chinese. His parents were. He was born in the Philippines, and all the Chinese people there are from Fujian province. My mom was born in Taiwan, and well, basically from my Fujian side of my heritage, also realizing that the reason why a lot of Chinese food in America and Chinatowns are Cantonese were at first. It's because the southern regions of China, and the coastal ones, Fujian, Chaozhou,
Shantou.
Chaozhou, Shantou, Fujian, mostly those. It was the people from those regions that went out in the world and went to Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, eventually America, some Indonesia. So going there, I recognized a lot of foods. Like, oh, that looks familiar to me. I've had something like this, and or some of them I knew I was looking for because growing up and having my dad's family share those heritage dishes with me. What I was most surprised by was even things like this dish we had. I was like, oh, raw fish. I didn't know Chinese people eat raw fish. I thought, and
I think this
you did some research on it.
Yeah, so raw fish, it literally is called shengyu.
Yusheng.
Yusheng. Oh, Shanghai. Oh, okay.
It's, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
And researching it, close locality of this dish is from a collection of 5 or 6 towns, and it kind of predates Han Chinese living in this region when it was the Baiyue people who have now merged into the Han genetic pool of Guangdong. And 2,000 years ago, they were using a kind of rice koji to process this raw fish to kind of create like a semi-fermentation, semi-dried process, and then eating it raw.
And out of necessity, right? Not
Out of
like
necessity, and didn't want to use too much fuel, and the summer's extremely hot, so you don't want to necessarily be hotter. So how can we process this with the kind of the natural conditions that we have in this region? And so they were eating raw fish and making little salads with like herbs and aromatics and this very lightly fermented bean paste. Then that style of eating raw fish and kind of semi-curing it, dry curing it, went off into the world, and that basically then ended up becoming sushi several hundred years later. And actually, there was this discussion that we had that, in no way can you say that sushi is Chinese, because that culinary development, that experience that you have in Japan, happened in Japan as a result of their social and economic and the conditions of their terroir and what there was available to them. But that kind of spark of necessity, the solution, came from somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And so we were talking, I don't necessarily like the word origins because it implies like, oh, we have this here and therefore it came exactly as we see it today from there. It just was picked up and dropped off. That's not how history works, So this idea of a progenitor of being something that kind of sparks the thought process, and then that goes off and inspires more development, more process, more refinement.
I like that word progenitor versus origin. Now you mention it. It nods to where it's from, but then you think, for example, sushi and sashimi in Japan. It's become its own tradition.
Yeah.
And it's nice to know about its progenitor. And then I'm sure when this dish migrated somehow to Japan, it wasn't maybe necessary to preserve the fish anymore. So they thought, well, let's do it a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. It's just.
And we have different types of fish, and we have different types of rice, and we have all this different, and just it's evolved in a different path.
Right.
And we were
so
talking.
Is it like not authentic anymore?
Is it no?
Or is
how
it,
do we? How does it? And also this argument that just because you like something doesn't mean you have to know its entire history. Like, oh, I like sushi. Oh, yeah, but do you know everything about sushi? No? Well, you don't like sushi then, do you? And this is kind of mentality that's becoming very toxic within social media and online, is that you can't necessarily say, oh, I like that movie. Well, do you know everything that the director's ever done? Mm-hmm. No, that's not necessary. You can like something from face value. It's okay. Mm-hmm. And so... Yeah, when we're tracing things back, I've got a lot of followers from all over Southeast Asia, and the comments that I was getting some of them were just crackers, hilariously funny.
Like, for example, like our first day there, you posted the changfen.
Oh yeah, the changfen. I think I put one in there actually.
It's that one there, and it's like. I've never seen it this way either. It's like a crinkly sheet that's just draped on the ingredients with a sauce.
And I'm from Chinese heritage. And so this is kind of...
well, you were just posting this photo saying, like, this is, traditional style. It's, it's got a rich gravy on it. Interesting. You weren't, like, you didn't have, like, a strong opinion about it.
No,
you were just
factual.
sharing it.
Yeah,
it's like, but it's this way. We have, I feel...
and we were talking, it's not necessarily about sharing culture, but it's about the attitude behind it.
Yeah.
Of that kind of like, okay, what you're having is an experience, but the experience is not as good as if you have it where I'm from. And there's that kind of dynamic where it's like this competitiveness. And
this was an interesting one.
When we had, what was the dish called again? Tangsong baobing,
which literally translates to sugar onion thin pancakes.
Pancake, yeah.
So they're thin rice pancakes with crunchy sugar, coriander seeds, sesame, and
And I had this
posted it,
message.
and-
This is a very new way of crepe I've ever seen. The Hong Kong version is one that was very famous since the 1940s. It's stuffed with shredded coconut and sesame, and the Wikipedia link. And I replied, well, in fact, actually, the Hong Kong and the Taiwanese varieties all descend from the version in Chaozhou. It's about 400 years old. And she never replied.
I'm still wondering about that.
No, she saw it, but she
Like-
didn't reply.
I mean, that's interesting for me because I was born in Hong Kong, and then just never occurred to me until you pointed it out that Hong Kong was basically a rock, you know,
fishing
100,
village.
150 years ago. And there is like a strong Hong Kong cuisine culture now. My mom's from Taiwan, so I know people there who are like, this is Taiwanese cuisine. And then I'm looking at, you know, what we're experiencing in Chaozhou, and people are saying, oh, we do it better in Taiwan. But actually, a lot of it came from Chaozhou.
Chaozhou, yeah.
So then, you know, in thinking about this, at first I was like, people should appreciate more, like, its origin in Chaozhou. But then thinking about, you know, my mom's being in Taiwan, having, you know, the culture there I grew up with a bit, I can also respect that they've taken, you know, their ancestors have taken it over to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore, and they adapted it, again, I think based on their circumstances. They went to a different country, they saw what was available, and added a bit of their own story to it. They like it a little sweeter, they like it a little different, and it's become its own tradition.
Yeah.
I think maybe the only problematic part was when people were sending, the way people kind of express it a bit aggressively, like, oh, it's better in Singapore,
Yeah.
or,
Without having been to Chaozhou.
yeah.
I mean, I think that ultimately what the people are kind of faced with here is digging up a history that they weren't aware of, so it highlights their own kind of lack of knowledge, but also perhaps that it's their culinary history is traced back to something that they maybe don't like the idea of. And it's like, you know, digging up history can be very dangerous because it might lead you to find out that your ancestors were all like barbaric murderers, or like, you know, they were all exiled because they were this and that, or, you know, and so maybe we don't necessarily want to always know exact history. But I still think that there's this kind of pervasive obsession with knowing exact history, knowing in a tidy kind of textbook formula. We want to know, you know, the day that chili came off the boat in China and the guy that did it, and like we want the receipts, because then that helps us, that gives us closure, you know, emotionally, because we know our ancestry, which often is so vague and so unwritten and so kind of handed down through stories. And also it gives us that ability to claim ownership and that kind of nationalism, and ability to say like, oh, my ancestors invented that. They must have been so clever because this dish is so delicious, and they must have known their shit, and they must have been such good and prosperous and you know, successful because they managed to create this elevated experience, this beautiful cuisine, this masterstroke of flavor. That's my claim. But also, you know, nationalism in its bare bones is being proud of things you didn't do and hating people you've never met. You know, so it's like really kind of analyzing our own biases of like, you know, so many people are so reluctant to say that their ancestry comes from China because of the political situation, not because of actual factual history. You know, it's because they don't want to say that they have that link, so they'd rather just end it at Hong Kong or end it somewhere else that suits their kind of personal narrative, you know?
Yeah. Well, but we have to wrap up soon. So I just want to know in a nutshell, like for you, how do people, chefs, home cooks, you know, innovate, or what's the better word we use? Like how do you create
bring your
new
own
traditions?
I mean, it's
and still feel authentic.
you can anyone has the freedom and the ability to do anything they want in terms of messing around with food. It's just about the wordage and how you frame things. It's people who say it's that Bon Appetit generation that was problematic. Like, we're elevating it, we're making it better. We're not making it better. We're adding diversity. We're broadening the spectrum, and we're making our knowledge of something deeper. That's it.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for sharing with us.
you.
Thank you, Jamie.